Welcome to Keeping the World Company on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. Today we'll talk about the next step. The next step is gaming national public opinion. Joseph Goebbels is not far behind. Our co-host for the show is Tim Apicella. Our esteemed guest for the show is Manfred Henningsen, Emeritus Professor, UH Manoa in Political Philosophy. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Today, we're going to talk about gaming national public opinion. That has to do with controlling the media. And so the question is whether Trump, with all his efforts and machinations, his leverage, his fear-mongering, can he stop the flow of information with the threats he is making, with the steps he is threatening to take? Tim, why don't you go first?
Well, he could appoint his cronies as loyalists to the FCC, which I think he's up to. And will it stop it? No. But will it hamper it and modify the media's attempt to report the truth? Yes. I think he will be successful in that effort. I think he's already been successful as to having certain media organizations concerned about what he can do to them. I'm thinking of Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski bending the knee, going down to Mar-a-Lago and trying to make nice. I'm thinking of Jeff Bezos' refusal to let the editorial department do that which they do, is to write editorials, good or bad, against Trump, and certainly in an endorsement, which they were not allowed to do. I'm thinking of the LA Times, same thing. So he's already very busy at these things. And so to answer your question, yeah, he could throw a real wrench into the whole works and start to bend the media to his will.
So Manfred, what's left? How do we find out what's really going on? How do we find out what the truth is when Trump is taking all these steps to stop the flow of information from legitimate journalism?
Legitimate journalism, yes, but we're not talking about only legitimate journalism. We are talking about a completely different media scene that was already part of the election, the social media. So newspapers are going more and more out of business. People don't read them. And for that reason, even the more sober and intelligent talk shows are not watched by the majority of Americans. They are on social media. And that cannot be stopped by anyone. I mean, I'm just reading a book, the biography of Liu Xiaobo, in China, and they tried to constantly block him, but he always found ways, or his friends did find ways to use the internet or any kind of other electronic media, digital media, to get their message out. Now, that didn't lead to the overthrow of Xi Jinping's regime. The same in Russia. Navalny didn't succeed there either. So in that sense, I think we will have this divided media scene. The media that we still believe in, we are still reading newspapers, we are still watching, the BBC and other channels, CNN, MSNBC, with their talk shows. But that's not what the majority of Americans seem to use as their media to inform them about politics. It's not only the young people. No, it's the parents also. So for that reason, we find ourselves in a completely different situation compared to even 4 years ago.
I think the great hope here is the media that is not exposed to his fear-mongering and threats, and God knows what else he can do with Congress and with the Supreme Court. The First Amendment is in great jeopardy. And I think, touching on this thing about social media is very important. So, for example, there are new social media channels that have come up in the last year or two. We started with Reddit, Twitch, Discord, Clubhouse, Be Real, TikTok, TikTok, imagine Lemon 8, that's with an 8 at the end. And more recently, we've heard about Blue Sky. We have Instagram, Telegram, which is questionable. We have AirChat, Mastodon, Wetpad. We have LinkedIn for a while. I'm not sure their forte is news. We have Substack, which includes Tim Snyder and Heather Cox Richardson. And we have one called Polywork. Those are the ones that popped up when I did a Google on this. So the point is, there are a lot of social media companies. I didn't mention X because I think that X is all Trump, and it's incredibly incredible that it's not telling us the truth. And I think that will reveal itself even more as we go forward with Elon Musk. What do you think, Tim, about the possibility of migrating to these social media platforms and trying to find news there? Is this a way that the resistance, if you will, can get the word out?
Sometimes these social media companies are merely functioning as a conduit. They're, what AP used to be to ABC, NBC, CBS, and the major newspapers. Now, so these social media entities are kind of acting as an AP source. And then what they put out, that then multiplies out to other social media organizations. So they're not really reporting new news. They're basically transferring on that which they've received from somewhere else.
No, it's a problem. One I didn't mention was YouTube, where we are using YouTube. That's our platform, and we put our commentaries and shows up there. And there are some shows that are very popular on YouTube, and maybe it's an important platform. But my sense of it is that the more visible you are, the more influential you are, the greater is your exposure to somebody like Trump who wants to shut you down. The other thing about social media, Manfred, I'd be interested in your thoughts about this. It's like Putin. Putin floods the marketplace. He floods the channels with social media. That's not true. And that way, what he does is he confuses people. He creates cacophony and confusion by putting, misinformation and disinformation on channels we might learn from. And so that undermines the possibilities for social media going forward. What I'm saying is it's very easy to counteract the messages that come from social media. And there are experts like Putin and probably Trump and his friends who will do what they can to neutralize social media as a legitimate source of news. Manfred, your thoughts on that?
In Trump's case, certainly you have the mastermind, Elon Musk, and his expertise that will help him. But look, the information market is so fractured between the media we were used to, newspapers and various television stations, and the social media scenarios that you just listed. I haven't been to any of them that you mentioned there, and I don't know whether I'm going to in the future. But this is where the people get their information. But you can say the positive, the negative about this, because I think you will have not only Trumpists using these possibilities, but the critics of Trump and his politics as well. So what you have, when you're looking at China and when you're looking at Russia, you have these counter social media that emerged. They become killed sometimes immediately, but they are alive, and young people are very good at, it's not for us to manipulate them. You need young people, the younger, the better. And I think you have there's a, when I'm reading that book about Liu Baozhou, he is telling us something, you know, about the creativity that you have, the dormant creativity that you have, not only in Chinese society, but in other societies, and the same is, you know, the fact in Russia, that will break through these walls of secrecy, you know, that the regimes try to establish. They cannot stop that from happening. So for that reason, I think the chances of Trump and his people, in a way, dominating the information market, I think this threat is limited by the counter possibilities that are showing up. But I think what you will get now is a boom in counter media as well. So I'm not that pessimistic about that. But on the other hand, you know, you have then the reality creeping in on the management of the truth. And when you're looking at Putin's Russia, you know, he is more and more endangered by the underperforming economy and by, you know, the death toll of his soldiers. So for that reason, you know, I am in that regard not that pessimistic as you seem to be.
Let me point out that we use Discord, we use TikTok, we post on TikTok, we post on Instagram, and we read Substack. So we're not completely unfamiliar with these. We haven't covered email. Okay, email is essentially linked with text messaging, of course, and email is linked with these social media sites, and email is linked with websites in general. And email, as we talked about before the show, is a problem because there's so much trash email that comes in. I personally get hundreds of trash emails a day. And in the run-up to the election, a lot of them, if not most of them, were from Democratic candidates. And the problem with that is it floods my email, and I don't see the email I'm looking for. I have to delete hundreds of emails that I get. And this is not doing anybody a service, because then what you have is the whole platform becomes neutralized because there's just too much of it, and people are not willing to hang around and go through hundreds of emails to find real messages. So I did not appreciate, and I do not appreciate all these Democratic candidates. I didn't get a lot of Republican candidates' email. Democratic candidates who are sending me email like every 20 minutes. And they're only asking for money, and they're not really helping me out in terms of making a choice for the election. And I think that was a huge mistake. Nobody coordinated them. Nobody coordinated their messaging, and nobody coordinated their requests for money. So, Tim, let me ask you, what do you think about email? Is email still a way to get the word out? If I get an email from Tim Snyder and he refers me to Substack, or Heather Cox Richardson, and she refers me to Substack, I'm going to take note of that. But it's buried in all the mountain of other email that I'm not going to look at. What about you, Tim? Can you talk to this?
First off, every time I click on an email, I'm 90% sure it's just a scam to get personal information out of my computer or off my phone. So half the stuff I won't even, 90% of the stuff I get, I know it's a scam, so I'm not clicking on it. From trusted sources, yes, I will open it up. When I see something from Robert Reich or Heather Cox Richardson, I'll open it up. I'll even open up email when I receive it from you, Jay. So the good news is it's still viable, it's still effective, but it's being bombarded by scams. And once something becomes non-credible, people will drift away from it. That's my 2 cents, at least. You know, I just want to say that although social media has, multiplied leaps and bounds in the quantities of what's available out there. We've always had a form of it. What Joe Rogan is today, as a very popular podcast, we had a gentleman by the name of Rush Limbaugh who was on AM stations, a conservative voice that was often, I thought, a stepping stone to some propaganda. We go to Russia, remember the old TASS news agency? Well, that's gone, but now it's in the form of Telegram. So these things, they shift, they disappear, yet they come back up in a different form, different format, different personalities, different names, but they're, basically one and the same. So that hasn't gone away. It's just that maybe the audience is more gullible than it used to be. I think critical thinking has not been taught in our schools. And to a certain degree, the absence of critical thinking gives entree to conspiracy websites, conspiracy podcasts, and some of those conspiracies take hold.
Yeah. And all of that is noise, really, for the thinking listener or viewer. And he has to really work hard to discern what's true. We haven't mentioned podcasts here, and we should. I have Spotify. Spotify has, oh gosh, a number of podcasts that are worth listening to, including the New York Times and the BBC and a half a dozen others. And I listen to them regularly because I have a lot of confidence in them. But query, is that the way to the future? Is that the way to clarity? Is that a way to better information? It is for me now, but I'm looking to the future. Manfred, do you ever listen to podcasts? Do you think
No.
they could be one of the solutions here?
One, but not the whole solution. I think, we are talking about the future. At this point, we still have an open information market. But if it should ever come to a closure, I think you will get an explosion of subversive, critical social media. I'm, almost certain of that. The same thing that happened in China will happen here, even on a greater scale. So in that sense, I'm not depressed, about the lack of information that we will be confronted with. I think we will become overwhelmed by social media that attack the existing system and all the flaws that we hinted at. So you will not look, in that sense, you could say the digital age is great for people in power, but it's also great for people who want to undermine power.
Well, let's look at HR 9495, which actually has passed the House under the astute leadership of Mike Johnson. This is a bill that would allow Trump to cancel tax exemptions for nonprofits that speak against him. It's his discretion. It passed the House even now before Inauguration Day, and now it's going to go to the Senate. And my guess is that in a Republican Senate, it'll pass there. So HR 9495 is really terrifying to organizations like PBS and NPR, which have been targets by Trump. And he has said he wants to cut federal funding. And I suppose this is just another way to do that, because they depend on A, federal funding, and B, their nonprofit status to allow their contributors to have tax exemption on contributions. This bill is really scary. Mm-hmm. Tim, your thoughts about this?
First off, I'd just like to say that you're mentioning nonprofits in the form of media companies. Right. Once this dam breaks open, what's to happen to the ACLU, which doesn't take on always liberal causes? They'll take on any cause if it's an abridgment to your personal Bill of Rights freedoms. But you know what? What happens to those religious organizations that preach politics at the pulpit? They're not supposed to do that, yet they get a tax exemption status. Be careful what you ask for, because you might get it. And, certainly a lot of fundamentalist Christian organizations, 30% of their time at the pulpit is to talk about politics and the virtues of Donald Trump. They could be also at jeopardy if this thing gets passed. Now, to go to your question, is it likely it'll pass in the Senate? It's anyone's guess. I mean, I would think that some of this debate would take place on, just exactly what organizations would be a target, which ones by collateral damage would be affected by it, and maybe they should think twice before they open Pandora's box about eliminating nonprofit organizations or tax exemptions for the nonprofits.
One of your assumptions here is that this bill, this law, assuming it is passed, would be enforced equally. Trump would have the discretion to use it and terminate the tax exemption for organizations he likes and organizations he doesn't like. He can decide. So if an organization has been complimenting him or not attacking him, he is going to leave them alone. And I suppose he wouldn't order internal revenue audits against them either. But if they attack him, or he believes they are part of this enemies of the people group, then he will pull their exemption. And what are they going to do? He would have the discretion under this statute. Now that's of great concern. You make the assumption, Tim, that we would still be living in a rule of law country. But if it's a rule of discretion country, like Trump's discretion, it ain't the same. Do you agree?
Not quite. And I guess I put a distinction. There's a difference between removing one's tax exemption status versus pulling someone's license to operate. He has threatened both, actually, with MSNBC, and he has threatened on both things, tax exemption and the license to operate. What happened to PBS years ago when part of their tax exemption or their funding was cut from the federal government? Well, if you remember, they had to bring on commercials to supplement those subsidies from the federal government. And they lost some of their audience because between the fundraising that went on for what seems like weeks and weeks, became cumbersome to listen to, and or the commercials were offensive as far as trying to hear from a nonprofit neutral news when the commercials being played were anything but neutral.
Well, you've talked about three things. The one, of course, is the tax exemption under HR 9495, which would deal with cover all nonprofits, including the ACLU, as well as telecommunications nonprofits, newscasters and the like. And then we've talked about the PBS contributions, federal funding for PBS and NPR. And then the third one is licenses. Now PBS and NPR, they don't get licenses, but I guess the structure is that you have to have a license from the Federal Communications, FCC, for certain purposes, certain organizations. And that would be a real problem because he's appointed a loyalist now to be the chair of the FCC. And he could pull licenses that way. So all organizations which require licenses are also at risk. You can see what he's trying to do. Anybody who doesn't like him, he's going to have huge levers of power over. And the people that like him, he's going to leave them standing alone, free to do and say whatever they want. This is part of a playbook that sounds a lot like Joseph Goebbels. Joseph Goebbels wanted to terminate all information that was adversarial to Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, and he succeeded. And he wanted to control the message. So what people got was state media. And after a while, not too long, a few years at most, everybody was buying into it. You can entertain people with state media, as Putin does, and they like that. And they forget about the truth. They forget about the other media. They forget about legitimate journalism. Manfred, what is the comparison here? Don't you think that the playbook that Joseph Goebbels, organized is a concern right now?
No, I'm sorry. I mean, Goebbels was not confronted with this media scene that you have in not only the US, but in all contemporary societies. So that the Goebbels model of propaganda, is a very limited, of very limited use to compare the situation that we will be confronted with. And I think you underestimate one phenomenon that will come into being once Trump becomes inaugurated, in January. And that is that half of the American civil society lives in a state of depression at this point. And this state of depression will be very, very powerful in order to, at what I mentioned earlier, to initiate the subversive talents that you have in this society. Now, you have to understand when you are talking about the United States, one thing that has always been fascinating to me is this very strange, underdeveloped support of culture in general. I mean, Americans do not, the state does not subsidize opera, theater, symphony orchestras, all of that. Whereas in most European societies, you have, this support for culture. And in this, and you have also the financing of public media, television, and people have to pay for it, in Germany, for example, and in other states as well. But I think what you underestimate at this point, you're in a state of depression that is shared by millions of people in this country at this point. But you will underestimate the energy that this depression will create.
Please remember that Donald Trump lies. He also blames other people for his own failure. And when it gets down to it, what he is going to be inclined to do, if to the extent that people are depressed and unhappy, they realize things are not working, he will blame someone else. He will not tell us what he is doing or not doing. He will merely send us a propaganda message. I need your thoughts on this, Tim. What do you think?
Well, in 2017, you and I did a show, I think it was with Cynthia Sinclair. We did a show about the dictator's playbook, and the 45 minutes was dedicated to the building blocks of propaganda. Donald Trump has exercised each and every one of them. And if you go to the playbook, the first thing you see right on the front page is the big lie. Well, since 2020, we've been experiencing an insistence of supporting the big lie. He's never let up on it. He never will. And he did what he accomplished. He got people to believe in it. And then, as a result, say that the system's corrupt because the big lie happened. Guess what? It was a big lie. Then you find your scapegoats. You find people responsible for the failings of what's happening in America. That's classic propaganda. That's a dictator's, first 5 things to do. If it's a coup d'etat and a dictator wants to take over a country, the first thing you do is you go into every media company, every TV station, radio station, and you shut them down. You just completely shut them down. There's an information blackout until you replace it with your TASS or your loyalist propagandists. So we've been watching the slow roll of propaganda enter into the media, enter into the radio, and it's taken hold. Oh, by the way, I forgot, repetition. The repetition of lies. That's on the first 5 of propaganda. It's not just always a big lie, it's every lie. And you repeat it ad nauseum until people get worn down and go, I'm tired of verifying or fact checking all these 30,000 lies.
We have a country where half the people in the country are buying his lies. We have a country where half the people in the country are essentially agreeing to his stop the steal position. And all of this is very troubling because whatever systems he's using, whatever methods and channels of propaganda he's using, people are buying it. Maybe it's this repetition is the mother of study, which in Italian is repetitio mater studiorum. And maybe it's people are not educated. Maybe he's got a certain charismatic hold over them, but he has succeeded and he is likely to succeed more. Let me add one more point for you to respond to, and that is this. He has threatened, he has tried to undermine. Morning Joe is an example of undermine. He has threatened people. He has threatened to prosecute them if they speak against him. He is going to have a loyalist Department of Justice and probably FBI. And the result will be that a legitimate journalist who speaks the truth in national media will be a target. He'll be a target for IRS audits. He'll be a target for investigation. He'll be a target for economic reprisals. He'll be a target for prosecution. And he is very often going to say, I'm out of here. Why would I want to risk my life and my family against a guy who has all the levers of power and who can make my life miserable? Why do I stay and do this? And I worry about Rachel Maddow. I worry about all the others who are on the air and who criticize Trump. So what I'm saying is this has got to have an effect. If you criticize them and you threaten to prosecute them, investigate them, and audit them, then a lot of them, without saying a word, are just going to leave the field. Aren't you worried about that, Manfred?
Look, we have been talking about this American syndrome long before the elections. And I always warned you not to underestimate the stupidity of people. And I think that is something that, the classic Greek philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, made that always a very powerful argument. But on the other hand, when I'm looking at my own depression, looking at the United States today, I must also say, in response to your summary, that half of the country did not vote for Trump. And this half, you should not underestimate. This half has become not only, it's in a state of depression like us, but this half has a lot of intelligence as well. And the creativity that will be triggered by all of these measures that both of you have lined up here, that will really put a hold, to what you seem to suggest, that the United States will become a copy of Putin's Russia and Xi Jinping's China. I do not think that in both of these countries you have a total control, as we always assume. So for that reason, I'm depressed. I'm really sad about what American politics has come to. But on the other hand, I'm also expecting that the 50% on the other side will not sit and do nothing.
I think it's clear that the road to dictatorship is paved with propaganda and a termination of free speech. Where are we on that road? Are you worried about free speech and the First Amendment?
First, I'd get to that question. If I could just respond quickly to something Manfred said. Waving a warning flag in my world, a brilliant, bright warning flag to all Americans about what's taking place, is far different than paving a pathway and an acceptance of what's taking place. I think it's the job of media to wave a warning flag, which they have not done effectively. Rachel Maddow, yes, and some journalists, yes, have done that well. I think in the last 7 years, ThinkTech Hawaii has tried to do some of that. So just want to clarify that one point is, I don't accept that which is happening, and not for a second. But I will talk about it, and I will wave the warning flag. To your question about the First Amendment, Donald Trump has been eroding the First Amendment. He's been eroding our Bill of Rights before he became the first president. And I think he's gotten better at it. The longer he practices the dark art of propaganda, the better and better he gets at it. And at this point, I think he's pretty much on a master level. Look at the nominees and the strategy behind the nominees. Is a classic way of a dictator getting what he wants by throwing up, sacrificial lambs that are so outlandish, they'll never make the nomination process, but he'll wear down the Senate. So again, a dictator's playbook. But his ability to use propaganda and the techniques of propaganda, and not just propaganda, but the techniques of rhetoric, which is a tool to be used either for negative or positive purposes. He is well steeped in that now, and he uses it to his advantage. And most people don't see it because they're not trained in rhetoric and how you could turn a phrase into something that hits your subconscious and the psychology of your mind to accept and persuade, and it works well.
Yeah, he's getting good at it. I mean, he managed to escape all of the impeachment process and all the lies and 34 felony indictments, as well as 3 other cases against him. He is Teflon. And part of that is he's drilled down, thanks to the advice of Roy Cohn. He's drilled down. He never surrenders, and people believe that. So he's created a whole universe of denial, and people believe that, and they are likely to believe it going forward. Okay, time for closing. Manfred, your thoughts. What would you leave with people about the subject? The subject being the next step is gaming national opinion.
I'm not as pessimistic as the two of you are, especially you are. I think, even though one argument that I made before the election, that one should never underestimate the stupidity of people, became confirmed. But I believe that the 50% or 49.5% that didn't vote for Trump will not simply sit there and get rolled over. And you will, especially among the young, you will get the young that didn't vote for Trump. I mean, the majority seem to have voted for him. You will get creative responses. So I do not think that you should give up hope that what you always connect with the First Amendment, but what is really an active civil society, an active political civil society has gone out of business in this country. I don't think so. It will return and will surprise you.
Tim, your last thoughts here?
Well, given the topic of, Goebbels and his effective use of propaganda and how that's evolved from 2016 on with the Trump campaigns and administration, I would just say to those Americans that were taught or have been taught how to conduct critical thinking, be it in junior high, high school, or college, to go back to those lessons, refresh yourself on what you learned. And as you look at social media, as you look at print media, as you watch television news, as you watch or listen to the radio, put on your critical thinking hat and start to realize that maybe you'll someday see patterns of propaganda, things of the big lie, things of repetitive lies, things that get into your psychological crawl without you realizing it. Take a look at that, and then step back and see if you can see the whole playing field and realized that maybe things aren't the way you simply believed before. And if you put on your critical thinking hat, you may come to some different conclusions. And I think if Americans had done that before this recent election, the results may have turned out quite differently.
Yeah, and I'd like to make 2 points. One is that, slightly over half voted for Trump in this election, but that's a lot of people. And it's an increase in the popular vote. And it is, as we speak, probably increasing further. The viewership on CNN and MSNBC is declining. The viewership on Fox News is increasing. And there are people who are doing this kind of voluntary acceptance of what he wants from them. They're acceding to his view of the world. And that's part of it. That's part of this kind of change of public opinion. He's using all the techniques he can possibly use. And the second point I wanted to make is a story about a movie called All Quiet on the Western Front, which was about the last few days, among other things, of the First World War. The German movie. It was made in the 20s, and when Hitler found out about it, he didn't want people to watch it. He thought it would be inconsistent with his view of making Germany a great power in Europe. And so he enlisted Goebbels to find a way to stop that. And what Goebbels did and proved himself to Hitler was he let rats into the theater on the opening night, and they walked all over people's feet. And people were terrified about the rats, and they all ran out of the theater. Shortly thereafter, they made it illegal to watch All Quiet on the Western Front. And that was very successful. And I think that was probably the reason that Hitler elevated Goebbels, because he was so creative in getting people to change their minds about some profound things. Anyway, thank you very much, both of you. Appreciate this discussion. And I'm happy that we can talk about it. Maybe in the future, we won't be able to. We've been talking about the next step is gaming national opinion, and arguably that's happening right now. Our co-host has been Tim Apicella, and our esteemed guest has been Manfred Henningsen. Thank you both. Aloha.